All right. G'day. Welcome back to Collectivitis, podcast where we dissect the disease that is collectivism. I'm Pietro. This is Max. How you doing, Max?
I'm all right, Pietro. It's been a sad few days after the election results in Victoria.
Yeah.
How are you doing? Are you okay?
I'm doing okay. I mean, I don't know what you're that sad about. Well, okay, look, sad. I get it. Dan Andrews got back in and everything, but I was not really expecting any different. So I wanted to get my hopes up a little bit, especially so when we spoke to Topher and Matt Wong about the Ian Cook thing and whether that was a realistic chance of Dan Andrews losing a seat in Mulgrave. I was much more optimistic about that than about Labor not getting elected, but I was very hesitant to truly get my hopes up about it.
I'm with you. I'm a realist, but I let the optimist get the better of me sometimes.
Yeah.
I was just imagining the parties on the streets.
Like as big as the protest movement, but just celebration instead this time, instead of like repressed anger. Well, we will get into all of that. That is the point of what we were going to talk about today. We were going to do a bit of a rundown after the election. It is just us today. But yeah, we've already entered the somber mood. I can see your Pray for Vic slogan in the background. But yeah, I look, if we're going to talk about it, let's talk about it. There's kind of two ways to look at the election. There's the broad way that most people look at the election, which is whether who forms government, which is the lower house, which is effectively always either Liberal or Labor, with the variation that maybe sometimes one of them forms a minority government where they have more seats than the other party, but they need to collaborate with the crossbench to form government. That was a possibility this time, whereby Labor might have a minority government and need the Greens to form a majority in the lower house. I'd say that's the fact that hasn't happened, and that Labor has a majority government is a net positive for our cause. Granted, it's not a great positive. The idea of rewarding Labor for the way that they have treated everyone over the last 4 years is disheartening, but a Labor government that is beholden to the Greens to get anything passed, the Greens are far more odious than the Labor Party. They would naturally, like, they'd say, okay, we'll do this for you if you do this other thing for us, and that negotiation would inevitably be something more left-leaning, probably more woke stuff, more that sort of thing, which is the direction that the Greens are veering in. So that's a positive. It's not anything to hang our hats on. It's not actually a good thing, but it's slightly better than having that minority government.
And the second sort of positive is that, we say times get darker before they get lighter, or, like you've got to go through the shit to get to the light at the other side, or, I've just butchered those two sayings, but Labor might double down on all the shit they've done in the last few years, and, that will awaken more people to the cause, which isn't always the nicest thing. We'd rather not have our cause, rather not have totalitarian governments, but if they do double down and go hard, the fight back will be a lot stronger next time.
I disagree with you there. I think so. When we say, like, I like the idea of, it's got to get darker before it can get light. I think that's true. And I think you're right. If Labor did double down and do something else that's extremely authoritarian, the reaction would be somewhat stronger to begin with. Like, if they say they tried to lock down for something minor again, there wouldn't be those first few months of grace that they had in 2020, well, that the whole world had in 2020, when it was something new and no one had really done anything this openly authoritarian in a while. I disagree that they're going to do anything like that. I think
they're too smart.
Well, that's right. The fact that they went as authoritarian as they did and the whole world did, everyone's kind of a little bit on alert now. Like, maybe people don't want to confront the fact that the response to COVID was a disaster worldwide. Like, it was completely over the top, and like clearly so from the data from the very beginning. Maybe they don't want to talk about that, but if something like that happened again, I don't think the vast majority of people are stupid enough to just trust without, at least the warning signs of, hold on, last time it was done really stupidly. So a really over-the-top authoritarian move now is, as you said, it's likely to warrant an even bigger response, for an even bigger awakening. I'd say the awakening that we were supposed to have from COVID, especially here in Victoria, has been dismal. But because of that, I think that not just the Labor Party, I'm saying any party, and the state, when looking to expand now, will go back to its old methods of just slowly, slowly turning everything into the public sector, expanding the public sector into all areas of private life, whether it's increasing taxes or just spending money. And as we discussed last week, increasing taxes in a hidden way through inflation or whatever it is that they do. It'll go back to that old way of just slowly state growing bigger and bigger and bigger, rather than some big over the top authoritarian move like they did in 2020.
Well, you never know. They changed the topic. There's a lot of talk that it'll be climate lockdowns next. People have had that drilled into them for the last, 20 years, 10 years especially, that the world's going to end if we don't tackle climate change. So it could be something just as hard, I think, just a different topic.
Look, you could be right, and I could be completely wrong.
I'm not.
And that's, and I know there are people who are like, well, now that they've set the precedent of, lockdown for the sake of everyone, for the sake of the well-being of the collective, that whole collective good notion that is so the antithesis of individualism. Now that they've set that precedent, there's nothing to say that they couldn't try something like that. I am of the opinion that they got a little scared at the revolt that happened during COVID. There were massive crowds everywhere in the world who were like, we don't trust the government on this. We are very much against what the government is saying to do. And I don't know if they'd risk that sort of open warfare, ideological warfare again. Soon.
Ideological warfare. I know we're going to talk about what's happening in China soon, but it can go one of two ways. It can go the way you're saying, where they won't risk it because of the pushback, or they'll have, I know Victorians got shot at by police with rubber bullets in the streets. That could be 10 times worse. Police at your door, locking you in your buildings, like we've seen in China.
Absolutely, and it's not to say that that's not something that might occur further into the future. I mean, if the government already had the iron tight grip that it would like to have, that say the Chinese government has, there's nothing to say that it wouldn't necessarily do that. To get to that point, it can't just be another huge authoritarian crackdown, because people in the Western world still see themselves as relatively free. They would buck that as it stands. Whereas if they the state spends the next 20 years, as it presumably will, just slowly encroaching more and more and more, and eventually we get to a point where, hold on, we are completely beholden to the state. They actually can do this, and there's not much that we can do to push back. Then that might be the time when they make some huge authoritarian push. My point was that I don't think they'll do that in the next 4 years in Victoria, and certainly not in isolation from the rest of the world. It's not like Dan Andrews is going to declare a climate emergency in Victoria, but no one else in the world is talking about that. He wouldn't dare. If, the coordinated agenda of every big, elite and political power around the world decided that this is the way we're going to go, which, look, they may, then Dan Andrews will do it, or the Labor Party will do it. Definitely won't do it in isolation. It won't be the Victorian Labor Party that leads the world in climate lockdowns before anyone says
nothing
anything.
Will surprise me anymore.
No. Well, look, if we did climate lockdowns, I'm sure Victoria would be the one that does it the most, but they wouldn't be the first to talk about it, because they don't have that kind of pull. Yeah.
Well, if we have a Greens state government next election, then expect it.
Well, I mean, the Greens are only growing every election, which is worrying. But yeah, so that's, well, look, we if we have climate lockdowns, you can say that you were correct and that I was wrong, and you will always have that over me, and I'll have nothing to do but sit inside and be sad about it while those rage around. So I mean, yeah, look, there's that grim outlook. But what I wanted to talk about more so than like, I suppose, like, yeah, we're talking about the results, but why the results happened the way they happened. Like, how did the Labour Party, with all the unpopular likeness of lockdowns and mandates and all the rest of it, how did they retain power in such a comfortable way? And some people will point to like the weakness of the Liberal Party and that sort of thing. I don't think that's true. I think it's because, like, if you look at the Labour Party, they are the embodiment of state expansion, right? Their whole purpose is to just expand the state, slowly encroach more money to public things. Like, the public energy now is their latest one, but, build $10 bajillion of roadworks and what, like, just pump more money into public things, fund more people through the public purse. And that's how they like, that's their whole modus operandi, right? And while they maintain the ability to do so, to spend all this inordinate amount of money and essentially buy people's votes, because of course, people in this region are going to pay for the government that gives them this nice thing, and people in this region are going to do the same thing, and different categories of people, whether it's construction workers or teachers or nurses or anyone who's working in the public sector, is going to vote for the people who are funding their area of interest. And while the Labour Party and the state and the government and whatever has the ability to print, to create money without a political cost such as raising taxes, instead having the cost of inflation, which most people don't make that link between the government giving me this free thing and that's causing my cost of living to go up. While they have this mechanism, there's no chance for them not to win the election.
Well, I do want to rip into the Libs for being pathetically weak at some stage, but I do agree with you. We both spent a bit of time at booths at pre-poll and on election day, and I'm sure we both saw the same thing, and that is not to stereotype, but a few certain demographics walking in, people quite dependent on the state, dependent on the public purse, walking in, going straight for the Labor how to vote cards, taking them, going straight in, like no question, no consideration of anybody else. Tradies as well. I saw a ridiculous amount of tradies in their high vis turn up, and they've been promised, we'll keep you 30 years of work, and the unions and everything will look after you. So they appeal to the people that are dependent on them, for sure.
Well, exactly. And I mean, there were those videos that got shared around a little bit of like the union rep telling all their the union members, which is compulsory in the construction sector, to be a member of the union to be allowed onto a work site. Telling them that we have to vote for Labor, no matter how distasteful we might find Dan, because
what was the exact wording? He might be a prick, but he's going to keep us in work for 30
something
years
along that.
Or so.
We can get a graphic up of that in this section, because it's quite funny. Bit late now because election's done and they all voted. Well, not all, but I'm sure many of them voted.
Mm-hmm.
But no, you're right to touch on the Liberal Party, because the Liberal Party is no longer in opposition to state expansion. Like, once upon a time, they would, when the government didn't have this mechanism of printing money and going in as much debt as it wants, under the assumption of no consequences, no matter what, like the amount of money the government spent was directly in tandem with how much it taxed. There was a much stronger argument for a conservative party, such as the Liberal Party. Their argument was, if you don't want your taxes raised by a huge amount, then we can't spend this amount of money. And that was like, and there were enough people who were taxpayers and whatnot who would want that, and eventually they'd vote a Liberal government. The Liberal Party doesn't do that either now. The Liberal Party expanded the debt the last time it was in power federally, and probably the last time it was in power in Victoria, which was only for 4 years before it got kicked out. So the Liberal Party doesn't offer any solution to the state's mechanism of just printing money to win votes. So why would anyone want to vote for the Liberal? Anyone who's voting for free money, why on earth would they vote for the Liberal Party when they're just going to do it slightly less than the Labor Party? If you're either don't care enough to look into these things, or you're directly benefiting on these things and you just want free money from the government, of course you're going to vote for the party that's going to give you the most free money. Like that's why the Liberal Party was slaughtered federally, was slaughtered in WA, was slaughtered in Queensland, was slaughtered in Victoria, was slaughtered in South Australia, and will be slaughtered in New South Wales next year, because they no longer present any alternative to what's happening. And even if they did, I don't know if there'd be enough people who are willing enough to not take the free handouts given the current state of the world. So I don't know that it's necessarily a winning position for the Liberal Party to become more libertarian on economics, although it certainly wouldn't harm for them to at least guide the conversation in that direction.
Well, what's the outlook of the states right now? There's only 2 states that aren't Labor, and that's New South Wales and Tasmania.
I'm not sure about New South Wales, definitely.
Yeah, Tasmania is Liberal as well. New South Wales state election coming up next year, early next year. If the Libs lose that, and then you've only got Tasmania left, I'm not sure when their state election is, and they lose that. What's the outlook for Australia when you've got federal and every single state government run by one party? What does that mean?
But I don't know exactly. I mean, it means exactly what's happening now. Like, it's not like the Liberals running anything gives any real difference to what we're doing. Like, maybe, yeah, the spending is a little bit looser.
Yeah.
But it's not like, let's say there's a miracle and in New South Wales, the Liberals win. It's not like it changes the direction of that state. It's still like the Liberals are still expanding the public sector to try and, scrape the next win, for which they have to buy the votes of certain demographics of people, which is what they do. What was the Liberals' platform at the state election just here in Victoria? Free lunches for everyone.
Yeah.
Like that. Okay. Yeah, that might be like a little insignificant amount of funding compared to some of the promises that Labor made, but they were promising all sorts of things across the board, and the principle is the same.
Yeah,
vote for us and we'll give you free things that you don't have to pay for on the surface, because you're paying for it with the loss of value of your currency.
Yeah, so I suppose they need to reevaluate their strategy. Are they better going hard as the complete opposite to Labor, and the left-leaning governments, or are they better being Labor light, as they've been coined so many times, and just being a more moderate version? I don't really know what the correct answer is.
Well, purely for the sake of trying to get into power, who knows? Maybe it is being Labor light, but that's still shit.
Yeah,
it's still a betrayal of their values, and it's clear at this point that if they're willing to even entertain that idea, they have sacrificed the notion of being principled on economic, sound economic management, because even to think, well, we might have to sacrifice some of the things we believe in because we want to hold power, then that's it. It's done. You'll just sacrifice more next time and more next time and more next time because you'll have to. Yeah. And they're willing to sacrifice, look, in 20 years, we might find that Liberal and Labor are back neck and neck. One of them wins one election, one of them wins the next one. But the Liberal Party of that, to get to that point, will have just given up so much that it will be, unrecognizable to the Liberal Party that it once was. It'll just be, we found a way to funnel more money through special interest groups here and there to win enough votes on this. Like, maybe they've got some unions of some description on their side, or some lobbyists, or they'll just have found some mechanism to exploit everyone's currency to funnel votes into their next win. Unless there's a radical shift within the Liberal Party, which everything we see now suggests there won't be, but that would be the situation in which the Liberal Party wins in the future.
Do the Liberals really think that appointing Matthew Guy as leader again was going to be a good thing? Do they really think that he'd be a strong opposition to Daniel Andrews, who, as much as I hate to admit it, is a strong leader within his party? He doubles down in everything he says, and he's powerful, and, he rallies all his supporters. Did the Libs really think Matthew Guy would be a good opposition? I mean, they went from a failure of Guy to O'Brien, who was a nobody and stood for nothing, back to Guy. Surely they could have found one person in their party slightly better than that.
Well, I mean, I don't know exactly how the inner machinations of the Liberal Party works, but generally, you need to carry enough favour within the big dogs within each, the party mechanisms themselves, and then you get to have a shot at being. So I don't know exactly who he was liked by and who he wasn't
Yeah.
liked by. But I get the idea of like, Dan is a more imposing figure. I think they were both unpopular. Personally, I don't think either of them are particularly liked.
Yeah.
I think that people's votes at the end of the day, look, I think a lot of Liberal votes were anti-Dan votes.
For sure.
And I mean, Liberal Nationals coalition, gained on their previous election results, largely because I think there was an anti-Dan sentiment that had grown since then.
And they were also shit last election too. So
yeah,
probably wasn't a great last election in the first place.
That's right. They got slaughtered last election as well. But yeah, I'd attribute the rusted on voters and those that swing most, or the biggest portion of those that swing, I should say, they do so for money. They do so because.
Did you see Daniel Andrews' victory speech?
I didn't. I couldn't bring myself to watch it.
I reluctantly watched it. It wasn't fun. I was very uncomfortable, and I managed to get through the whole 11 minutes of it.
Yeah.
It was horrendous. It was scary. It was just his body language and his face and his expressions, the way he was talking, the optics in a different regard. Like, you remember the Joe Biden speech from a few months ago, the lighting and the setting was just evil and it resembled like a Hitler speech. Without the visual side of it, it resembled that as well. Like his facial expressions, the way he was talking, he was just throwing out like 3-4 word slogans. We're not doing what's popular, we're doing what's right. And the crowd would cheer. And then you'd be like, vaccines work. And the crowd would flip their shit and just be like, yeah. It was just horrendous. And his wife just looked so uncomfortable next to him the whole time. I think most people would be pretty uncomfortable standing next to him. But yeah, I want you to watch it just so you can see what I mean. But at the same time, it was not a fun 11 minutes. It wasn't nice.
Yeah. I mean, look, I get it from his point of view, right? He's been dragged through the mud by everyone who can't stand him. And this is his victory lap. I'm not expecting someone who did, however many consecutive days of press conferences for 2 hours a day and who loves themselves and the attention that they got so much to not do a bit of a victory lap after his opponents did everything to try and tear him down. Like, I would expect nothing less from Daddy Daniel. That's that sort of dystopian dictatorial speech. Not that I haven't seen it yet, but I'll give it a watch. That doesn't surprise me. Yeah. Well, the other thing I wanted to talk about was the upper house. So the lower house, to most people, that's what they think of when they think of the election. The lower house, maybe we held some hope of Daniel not getting his seat, but the Labor Party was pretty much a shoo-in no matter what. The upper house is where there can be some libertarians in the crossbench, namely David Limbrick and Tim Quilty were for these last 4 years. This turned out to be problematic this time round because David Limbrick and Tim Quilty were pretty much the faces in Parliament of the protest movement. They gave all of the hope to all of anyone who was involved in the protests around like October to December of 2021 knew who they were. There's that video of David at one of the protests just standing there, and everyone in the crowd is coming up to him to say hello. This is a politician. This is a politician in the upper house. No one knows they're politicians in the upper house normally, and he had received this sort of celebrity status because he was standing up for individual rights and liberties at a time when individual rights and liberties were completely oppressed. It would stand to reason that at this election, there should have been much more support for the two libertarians in Parliament. There's a problem here. Politics is a disgusting, dirty game, and it attracts the worst people in the world. That's why we're both interested in politics, because it attracts the very dregs of society.
Yeah, some people may believe in the right things, but for the wrong reasons. And I think we saw a lot of that with the dilution of the freedom vote, if we'll call it that.
Well, not even the dilution. So all these people who went to all the protests, like, hundreds of thousands by the end of it, when they had become legal and they weren't, restricted anymore. There were, like, maybe not hundreds of thousands, but like 100 to 200,000 is where most of those estimates sort of sit for the biggest one of those protests. All of these people, like 100,000 votes to David Limbrick or Tim Quilty, is more than enough to get them re-elected without having to worry about, the dirty preference deals and negotiations, which ends up happening. But because politics is such a disgusting, dirty game, what happened is that 6, 7, 8 new parties, or parties that have a completely different platform, adjusted their platform or cropped up and created and tried to get elected on this wave of public sentiment. UAP, there is nothing about anything UAP has ever said that suggests that it is for individual rights and liberties in all situations. Same with One Nation, the parties that have cropped up since then, and yet suddenly that became their whole platform. Why? Because they thought they could ride this wave. When you have parties like these, with the amount of money that Clive Palmer for UAP has to throw, he threw 100 million at the federal election and got a senator in ahead of David Limbrick, a senator who had done nothing, someone who had done nothing prior to that election, but received this inordinate amount of money through advertising, got in and is now the voice of the protest movement, despite having likely no idea about libertarian values or what freedom actually is. It's this diluted version of freedom. It's this, superficial version of freedom that they talk about. So that's become very much clearly a problem. And the same thing happened here at the state election, is that the libertarian members of parliament have both struggled, and we don't know yet exactly who will get elected because it takes a couple of weeks for the upper house results to come in, but it may be that none of them get in. After the 4 years of the most draconian laws in the world, and after the most visibility that the libertarian movement in Australia has ever had, we actually can't get anyone elected or re-elected, possibly, simply because politics is so dirty and the lowest common denominator is throw money at advertising and the public. And because voting is compulsory here, most of the people who actually decide who gets elected and who doesn't are the vast majority of people who don't pay any attention to the news or the movement itself. They just pay attention to what they see on ads on the TV or ads on the street. So it's the fact that the movement has been kind of hijacked by this right-wing populism, vague, opportunistic.
It was almost bound to when you've got like a super left-wing government, and no opposition in the Liberal Party. I suppose you're just going to attract that super right-wing conservative crowd to try and be the opposition. And you've got the libertarians who are a voice of reason, but a lot of these people don't want reason. They want to push their own agendas. They want to take advantage of the freedom movement and push all these topics and agendas that suit their narrative. There's a lot of talk about all the freedom parties working together, like the debates where you've got like the 6 or 7 freedom parties side by side, and you read the comments and everyone's like, why are they fighting? Why don't they just work together and actually achieve something? Cool. Join us.
Well, yeah, it's
join the ones that are actually elected already and are making a difference, and listen to what we have to say, and identify as a libertarian or don't. But yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Like, why won't they all join together? Well, because most of those parties, one, had no interest in the ideas of liberty prior to right now. 2, probably don't understand the depth of the philosophy and why that philosophy is applicable to all areas of life. Because unless you understand the comprehensive philosophy, otherwise it's just talking points.
Yeah.
They all have the same talking points. Less public spending, or no authoritarianism, or this, that, or the other. But like, if you don't understand why it was the natural libertarian idea to come to these conclusions in a time of crisis, there's nothing to say that in the next crisis or the next thing that pops up, you'll make the right decision, because your decisions are made purely on what I think might get me some votes right now. Whereas libertarianism is based on a philosophy that isn't changed by the number of votes that it gets and is correct. And that's 100% of the time.
And that's the reassuring thing about being a libertarian, is that, like, you never have to actually think too hard about things. You're like, okay, naturally I know what's right and I stick to it.
Yes, well, that's right. I don't have to think too hard. That's the reason I'm a libertarian.
Exactly. I say it's easy, but also, like we've spoken about, libertarians lose a lot, so it's not that easy.
Well, that's right.
It does hurt a little bit.
And I mean, we don't know the results yet. It may well. It's still in the dance.
Hey, what do you think about all the votes to legalize cannabis? Does that make your blood boil like it does mine? Because they don't really have much of a much in the way of policy or candidates for that matter. Like, there's a candidate in Western Victoria who's likely to get up. He did not run a campaign. He announced himself like 2 weeks before the election, and they get this whopping primary vote. And it's literally just the name and a good ballot draw, and that's all it is.
Yeah, I mean, that's I get the hatred for it, and like it's super frustrating, right? You run a campaign on a philosophy that is universal and could right many of the wrongs of what's happening, and you get beaten by a party that actually aligns with you on this one particular issue, but they've got a funny name that everyone who doesn't give a flying fuck votes for the pure reason that is. I think it's a testament to just how shit the whole system is. Like, I don't mind that a bunch of them got in. But it's kind of like, it's all really this shallow and shit. And I mean that it's if we're looking at like solutions to having something like that, because otherwise, why doesn't everyone just pick a really catchy name for their party? The Sex Party certainly did that before becoming the Reason Party. That was their whole strategy. So, we could call ourselves the Sex, Guns, and Rock and Roll party.
Legalized crystal meth party.
Yeah, legal. Yeah, well, that's right. We just outdo them. But the only like the actual solution, an actual solution to this would be not having compulsory voting, where people who don't even care enough to be informed on someone they'd want to vote for more than a funny name have to vote, otherwise they get fined. If you had, like with this system here, it's obvious that kind of strategy can be exploited. But anyway, I feel like this is a lot of just us bitching because the election didn't go our way. But I mean, that's
depressing post-election debrief.
And blaming everything.
That's the title
of
this episode.
Other than ourselves, we should have done better. We can make all the excuses that we want, but I mean, I'm sure there's a universe where maybe there was a better chance for libertarians to have gotten in.
All right, Pietro, you've got some news on the protests in China. Let's dissect them a bit.
It's kind of okay. So it's kind of a point I want to make. We're doing a big 180 turn now. We're not talking about the election anymore. Let's talk about
It's getting too depressing.
So let's go for a less depressive topic, depressing topic, and talk about the brutal humanitarian crisis that's occurring in China.
Oh, it's cheering me up already.
So the in China, there's been a lot of noise lately, even by the media, anti-lockdown, anti-government authoritarianism protests going on in response. And they started because a house was on fire, and they have the doors are literally barred on their apartments sometimes when they're in lockdown. So like the people couldn't get out and no one could go help them, and they burnt to death in full view to the public. And so they started, some protests started. But the interesting thing is, of course, the protesters in China are extremely brave, because it's a lot more dangerous to protest in a country that is far more authoritarian. The consequences could be really dire for a lot of those protesters. So it is really brave what they're doing. But the attitude, the thing that I'm interested in talking about is the attitude that the media has about these protesters. Their portrayal of them and what they're protesting and everything that's happening is entirely positive, which is great. But it makes a really interesting comparison to what the protest movements were painted as prior to that. And yeah, the severity is different of the level of authoritarianism, but it's still authoritarianism that was being protested.
Do we need to wait for it to get to that point before we get like a nice rap in the media? Is that what they want? Like, you need
exactly. We need to be oppressed enough.
Can. Yeah, that's one thing. During, just to go back a little bit, just during the lockdowns and everything, you and I both spoke up, within friends and social media, whatever, and saying like, we're being oppressed, things like that. This is an oppression. That's what you get written back to you by friends. This is an oppression. These people are oppressed. It's like, okay, do we need to wait until it gets to that point to call it out? Or do you want to stop it in its tracks?
Exactly. Like, to make a comparison, you don't have to have an identical situation with identical levels of severity. No, a comparison,
not a competition.
A comparison is noting similarities between two things of which there are demonstrably, heaps and heaps and heaps. And look, I'll show you. Without, I'll let the video do the talking for me.
Interestingly, a lot of the time, he wasn't actually wearing a mask, and nobody else was either. And it's sort of, it's only jarring if you've been living with a mask for 3 years. So a lot of Chinese were going, well, wait a minute, what's going on here?
Could go all the way here. He has!
And then, just by coincidence, you also have the World Cup happening. And they're going, well, how can the World Cup be happening there when we're still locked down in our houses?
Okay, so that's ABC. It was important to note that that's ABC that's like reporting on this. ABC is the Australian Broadcasting Channel, supposed to be, this completely unpoliticized government news channel that portrays just facts purely as they are. Now, that's an interesting point. So that the broad, I'll show a little bit more later, but the broad point is, this is what the people in China are experiencing. And it's a really good point that they bring up, is that while the Chinese people are locked down and have been so in, this vague chase for COVID zero, on the other side of the world, there is the World Cup going on. Like, the biggest, most exuberant celebration of the biggest sport in the world, with people packed into stadiums. And the World Cup is, it's so widely appreciated that it's seen even in China. They can't hide the images of the World Cup and how these packed these stadiums are. And it's a great point. What are you meant to think if you're a Chinese person being locked down for reasons of, public safety? Otherwise, the world's going to end. Like, what could be a reason so dangerous that I can't be allowed to leave the house? And on the other side of the world, they're completely ignoring it. An interesting parallel that I would like to point out is that in 2021, so Victoria was locked down in May, June, July, August, September, and October. 6 months, not consecutively. There were like little snippets in which we weren't locked down, but there wasn't a month since April where Victoria didn't have a lockdown. And most of these lockdowns went for quite a while, the last of which went for 77 days. In July, right in the middle of one of these lockdowns, there was a similar event to the World Cup going on elsewhere in the world, the European Championship, which is the second biggest soccer tournament, second only to the World Cup. And so while we were in the midst of lockdowns in Victoria for our public safety, these were the images that we could see on the television.
This is Wembley. It's borne witness to Live Aid, to knockouts and knockbacks, from U2 and Queen to Ricky Villa and Lionel Messi. It is the venue of legends. So remember who you're with, because tonight we put more names on that list. We stand for the national anthem.
Pietro, did you just show that because Italy aren't in the World Cup and you want them to relive the glory days of the Euros?
I must confess, I am very sad that Italy, I'm Italian, I'm very sad that Italy aren't in the World Cup and weren't at the last one either. And we did win the Euros, and that was the final that we beat England in. So there were two, yes, I had an ulterior motive to why I showed that particular game. But do you get my point? 90,000 people at Wembley Stadium in London, which had far more COVID than Victoria ever had. And we're in lockdown, not allowed to see our friends and families or play sport. I wasn't allowed to play soccer for my local club in front of the 100-odd people at most that come to watch our games, because it was a risk to public safety. And I really like playing soccer. And 90,000 people can go to a stadium. And this was before they even had the excuse of vaccines or mandates, because it wasn't mandated yet. So like that, yes, great point about the Chinese, but the exact same point can be made about Victorians and Melburnians.
Yeah.
Like to a T.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you've actually seen this time around a lot more Chinese fighting back. You know, there's footage of them, like I saw footage of some guy who owns a restaurant, and, you know, the government have put up like these boards out the front, and he just kicks it down. And it's just like, fuck you guys, I'm doing what I want. Do you think...
Interesting though, that the violence of the protesters there, justified, entirely warranted and justified, is painted in this light of like, look how brave they are standing up to authority, when, you know, if a protester stepped out of line, and many of them stepped more than out of line when the protests were going on here, it was in an entirely different light. There's a couple of videos that make that point a little bit further as well. So was that everything you were going to say?
Well, I was just going to try and nail it down to why that might be happening in the media. Do you think it's gotten to the point of time where, you know, things are okay, inverted commas for those not watching on YouTube, over here, it's like, is it now that looks really bad over there because things are okay over here? Or is it the media changing their narrative because, you know, they just love fueling the fire, you know, more clicks for them by dividing people and having us look at that and say, oh my God, that's horrible. But why, you know, what we're talking about now, why didn't we get that response?
I think it got to a point where the media here was not able to continue the narrative.
Yeah, people were dropping off.
Yes, there was too much dissent, and the protest movement was enormous in Melbourne, as much as its coverage was not necessarily suppressed, but certainly limited compared to how many people were showing up to this thing. The level of dissent just made it pretty patently obvious that they couldn't continue this. And you know, right at that time, like the Omicron erupted and everyone suddenly had COVID, and we were, whether we were going to be fine or we weren't going to be fine, there was no stopping it. So, I mean, at that point, the narrative for a Western country no longer was possible to maintain. And you know, now time has passed, and now it's kind of feels good to look at this other country being super authoritarian and praise its people for standing up against it, as if like that is not so inherently hypocritical.
People have run out of virtue to throw around, so, you know, let's look out for our Chinese counterparts now.
Yeah, that's right. Now we go back to being, you know, humanitarians that care about individuals being oppressed by government. I'm very snarky this week. So I will show a little bit more of the video from the Chinese protests.
Zero COVID remains China's official policy.
China has been following the dynamic zero COVID policy and making adjustments based on the realities on the ground. We believe that with the leadership of the Communist Party of China and the cooperation and support of all Chinese people, our fight against COVID-19 will be successful.
It's not based on science now. The heavy-handedness of the lockdowns, the obsession with testing every day, it doesn't have the benefits that the government is telling people it has.
In global terms, China has been successful in suppressing the spread of the virus, mainly through draconian lockdowns, but with relatively...
So, a couple of things there, right? First of all, how interesting that those, like, there is a direct one-to-one parallel between what the Chinese fellow was saying and like the rhetoric at peak lockdowns. We work together, we can defeat this virus. And yes, like the social pressure right now has changed for us, but this is only a year apart.
Yeah.
And it's the exact same scenario we're talking about. We are only 1 year apart from the way communist China is using authoritarianism to exploit a crisis. We are one year's the Western world is only 1 year away from a direct one-to-one parallel.
It's crazy how quickly things change, huh? It's well, remember the goalpost is continuously changing, like every 3 days over here, with our goals and objective in regards to COVID and in regards to how strict of a lockdown we'd have.
It's crazy how much public sentiment changes based entirely on what the man on the television is telling them.
Yep.
As soon as they stopped talking about lockdowns and whatnot, the public, this topic wasn't taboo anymore. It was taboo a bit over a year. But a year and a few months ago, this was very much like taboo. You were, you couldn't swim in the same circles as you normally did because of your views. But interesting that they talk about the police like brutality against the citizens of China, like dragging those people out of their houses and whatnot. They never spoke about that here. And yet it happened here in exactly the same way. Like if you look, so that's ABC. You can't find footage of this played on ABC. If you look up, police brutality Melbourne on from ABC, there's nothing. You can find it because there's heaps of people that filmed it, and I'm about to show a clip from it right now. But it's very interesting that this supposedly apolitical, only the truth broadcasting station is literally hiding a parallel that is 1-to-1. So let's have a look at that.
Oh! All right, get the eye gouge in there. You gotta wait for what do you call it?
So I mean, yeah, they were kind enough to shoot the protesters with rubber bullets there, as opposed to actual bullets. I guess
it does make you wonder just how different it could have been if the public sentiment was, well, if everything was fairly reported on over here, just how different the public sentiment would have been, and the domino effect to how draconian the lockdowns and response was.
You're exactly right. And that is a perfect segue to show you my last video, which is how the protest movement was portrayed by ABC, the exact same news channel here in Australia, for over the exact same thing. Granted, we were shot with, not me personally, I was never shot with rubber bullets, but Victorians were shot with rubber bullets. The Chinese are probably shot in a dark room with an actual bullet. But the thing that they're protesting is the exact same. Government exploitation of a crisis through authoritarianism and using this power to expand at the cost of the individual.
It's been a day of extraordinary scenes in Melbourne. Police say at its peak, close to 2,000 angry protesters took to the streets. The mob marched for hours over the course of the day, chanting anti-vaccination slogans and even taking over the Westgate Bridge for a time. The chaos follows a government decision to shut down the state's construction sector for 2 weeks amid concerns about non-compliance with COVID rules. Jessica Longbottom begins our coverage.
Anger on the streets of Melbourne, with Victoria Police pushed to its limits. The city's lockdown streets were taken over by fluoro-clad protesters. Overnight, the government announced a 2-week construction shutdown because of repeated COVID breaches. Emotions spilt over. Bystanders were simply caught off guard.
I just jumped in my truck, just trying to get away from everything, and they just sort of started jumping in the back of the truck.
Tensions had been building from early morning as a couple of hundred people gathered out.
All right, so that's pretty much makes my point. Notice how, I mean, there's absolutely no mention of police violence in these in this situation, despite I was there. I saw police violence. I'm sure they caught a bunch of it on camera.
Yeah. Obviously, like there's a bit of footage where, you know, people are going at the cop cars and kicking them and throwing bottles. Again, like that was likely justified as a reaction to police violence in the first place. But I love how the headline is angry protests, and it's just got footage of a bunch of tradies walking really calmly, because that's what 95% of the protest is like.
Yeah, I mean, the going to one of these protests and then hearing about it in the news was one of the strangest experiences. Like a couple of thousand, like that one in particular was like 10,000 minimum. Like that is as low ball as I will go to not, try and overstate how many people there were there. Well, there were probably more.
They didn't want people to think like, oh my God, there's 10,000, 50,000, 100,000 people. I'm missing out. I want to go and join it. They didn't want people thinking that.
That's right. And they called it a mob. Do you know? Do you know what we did for most of that day? It was walking. It was exhausting because we got shuffled from area to area by the police on the horses and with the SWAT outfits. They didn't want us anywhere. So they just kept shuffling us from area to area. And for ages, like, just kept moving because we didn't want to fight the police. Instead
of a mob or a protest, I should have just called you guys an exercise group.
We were getting our 1 hour exercise that was allowed at the time. That was during a lockdown as well. That was during a lockdown after the Euros.
Yeah.
So just imagine like that level of cognitive dissonance, going through that experience, fighting or running or whatever, seeing cops on the street using violence, and there was violence from the protesters as well. I'm not going to pretend that drunk tradies don't enjoy a punch up with a cop every now and again. I saw that firsthand as well. But that this is, and we're in a lockdown. Like, this is literally illegal to walk around the city while the Euro final with 90,000 people in Wembley Stadium to watch Italy absolutely dominate England in a 1-1 draw that we won on penalties.
Shut up.
Look, I mean, it's strange to reflect on these times because, as time has passed, like even the talking, it doesn't feel like it was real. But when something like these Chinese protests and the media lauding them for their bravery, and you'll know, anyone watching this knows, like the people, even friends and regular people now, that they're talking about those protesters with empathy and sympathy, as they should.
I wonder if anywhere else in the world reported on our protests in that light.
Yeah, good question.
I feel like we would have heard about it if they did. So I'm going to say there's a good chance nobody did. There's probably some tiny little Pacific island somewhere. It was like, look at what's happening in Melbourne.
I remember being in the one, that particular one on the Westgate, when we were walking like that day and realized quite how huge the crowd had gotten. We didn't expect the crowd to get anywhere near that size. When we realized how huge it was kind of like, whoa, this is going to make like national news. This is going to blow up. And then it kind of didn't. It fizzled out. I remember on the way home, the radio, the ABC said it was right-wing extremist groups that had ties with the Nazis that were protesting. I had to listen to that after spending a whole day walking with these people and talking with them and being like, wow, you guys are just some really nice people that I'm glad I've met after being stuck in my house for 1 billion years.
If the modern day Nazi is someone who is like, switched on and questions the media and questions what the government are doing, then call me one, okay? Call me one.
That's it. You heard it here first. Max self-identifies as a Nazi. They'll snip that clip.
I know.
The powers that be, they'll snip just that clip, and
everyone who disagrees with me is a Nazi.
Well, that's the argument of our opponents. But anyway, so I've I probably hogged the conversation today a little bit. I was very angry rewatching a lot of these and very animated thinking about all of it. Have you got any last thoughts, Max?
You were angry. I was quite somber today. You know, it's been a tough few days with the election results coming in.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, 2 absolute shit shows running for government, but you just feel like the current government should not have been rewarded for the way they treated us. As we saw through all these little snippets of news, and we've got to make sure we never forget what happened.
That's right. And unfortunately, it's human nature that time heals, and it's very easy to forget these things once your life goes back to some semblance of normality. We'll see how willing they are to.
We'll make it our mission to make sure people don't forget, as traumatic as it may be to remember this stuff.
Yeah, we'll see how willing they are to forget when their currency is completely devalued or we enter an enormous recession purely because of government overreach. Anyway, how depressing.
On that note, I'm going to go to sleep and cry.
Yeah, pray for Vic. All right. Follow us on, subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Instagram, and like us on Spotify if you would like more depressing messages about the state of the world and our future. We'll catch you later. Bye.
See you, Pete.
Catch you, Max.